Julia, welcome to Ultrahabits. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, RJ.
We talk a lot about our kids on this show and how well or bad we parent. And we're pretty open on this show about just the challenges that we have as parents. And a lot of the conversation that we've had is how do we rear our children better, right? And some of that is around education. And you have been helping me with my son for some time now in terms of tutoring, and he's remarkably improved. It's been a challenging road. It's been tough, but he's doing well, and I want to talk about that because I know a lot of parents are having similar issues and concerns and worries. And before we go into your philosophy and everything you do, you're a teacher, right? You originally a teacher, is that correct?
Yes, so I'm a primary school teacher. So I've got my bachelor's in primary education. However, 6 years ago, or maybe it's even 7 years ago, I realised I was really passionate about teaching literacy. So I did it's like a postgraduate. It's not a postgraduate, but it's like that equivalent, so that I could specialise in teaching literacy and specialise in kids with learning difficulties.
And did you know that you always wanted to teach? Like, was it a passion or was it something that you kind of evolved into?
Yeah, I think I did always want to teach, and I can see it in my daughter now. Like, she's very similar to me. So yes, I think I'm a bossy person by nature, so I like controlling groups and telling people what to do. And also, my dad's a teacher. Well, he was a teacher. I followed my dad in lots of pathways. He was an artist. I love to do art, and so yeah, I think I did want to be a teacher.
It's a noble profession. I think it's a difficult profession, particularly when you're teaching young children, right? There seems to be a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start with how hard it is. It's actually understanding your content is hard, but then the classroom management is next level. And then on top of that, you've got all the administrative tasks that you have to do as well. So being a teacher, at least in Australia, that's my context in Australia, is very, very hard.
When you were coming up in terms of like learning to become a teacher, or like you were in university, are there like different philosophies and theories? Like, I guess what I'm trying to understand, for most of us lay people, are there different frameworks that are embraced by different societies? Where does the innovation come from? Where's the thought leadership? Like, how does something become standard practice?
That's the reason where we're at this point, because there was originally in the 50s and 60s, kids were taught very, very well how to read. So they were taught very explicitly and directly. However, come 70s and 80s, they realised, they realised the belief system around the way that we wanted children to be brought up, particularly in the classroom, was they didn't want them sitting in rows. They wanted it to be more involved. They wanted kids to be part of the process of learning. So rather than the teacher standing out. So the philosophy was that, hands-on learning, inquiry learning, kids shouldn't be sitting in rows. That's too authoritarian. We want more of a dialogue between the kids and the teacher. So the philosophy of that in itself is quite sound. And you would say that, yeah, that sounds good. That's what we want for our kids. However, that philosophy then went too much into how we teach kids to read. So what we've ended up with is, and it depends on the university, but the majority of universities across Australia, America and New Zealand, because they were all impacted by the same belief system really, it's all centred around this belief of how we teach kids to read or how kids learn to read. It's a belief system. It's a philosophy. It's not science. So yes, the schooling system is completely centred around what we think we want for kids rather than what we know is actually best for kids.
What is it that we think we want for them?
Back around the 80s, early 90s, they were sort of looking into how do we teach kids to read? What's the process? So back then, well, actually, that's not even true. Again, back even earlier, we were getting some information of what the brain's doing. But rather than using scientists, teachers decided, I'm going to try and investigate how kids learn to read. So rather than outsourcing, they sort of essentially tried looking at kids and watching their habits. So they came up with this belief, and I keep on saying belief because it really was a belief, a belief that children use clues to help them read. So they use the picture to help them read. They use the context of the story to help them read. They use what the word looks like to help them figure out the word. So rather than figuring out what's the brain actually doing and what do we as skilled readers actually do when we read, it was based on what do we think kids are doing. And it evolved from that. So essentially a couple of teachers did some study, said, okay, I think children are looking at the picture, they're using the clues. How can we teach them to read in this way? And it just sort of snowballed from there. So that system was what one person developed, and we called that the 3 cueing system. That went from there, and they went and spread their belief system essentially across. It started in New Zealand, then went to America, went to Australia. And so really now universities, the majority, some are really doing a good job, some are not anymore. But the majority of universities, so like when I went to university, that's how I was taught children learn to read. So I went through my university, my 4 years, thinking if I read children lots of books, just like we tell parents, if I read them lots of books and we have lots of rich discussion about the book and we talk about the interesting words and we look at the pictures, that they're going to learn how to read, which is not the case at all. It builds vocabulary, it builds interest in stories. Great. We really want those things as well, but that doesn't teach a child to read at all. So we've ended up with lots and lots of children, much to parents' dismay, going through school and they're not actually learning anything that's actually teaching them how to read. And unless they're that really tiny tier, like 10% of kids that will learn no matter what environment they're in, they're going to struggle.
That's really interesting because, like, when I reflect back on myself as a child, like, no one actually read to me at night at home, but I actually read well. Like, I started reading quite young and read well, but I feel like it was more based on repetition and focus, and like things weren't so Socratic. And I think there's a time for kind of Socratic learning and dialogue, but I feel that's more abstract. And there's also time to kind of like hit time on tools, right?
No, yeah, it's too sort of wishy-washy, this sort of that because it is important to read to your children, but if you read to your child every single day and they can't read, that's not because you didn't read well enough, or if you didn't read to them enough, it's got nothing to do with what you did. And also the teacher reading great books every day, that's fantastic, and it builds vocabulary, which we really want, and comprehension, but it's not going to teach them to read. So we need to sort of, and that still happens now. I have parents always saying to me, did I not read enough to my child? Or the teacher's telling me that I need to be reading more at home. That's not going to magically teach them to read.
Do we have a view on like what Eastern societies do, or societies where they don't speak English as a first language? Like, are there better systems that we've seen across the world?
All I can speak is maybe European languages. They don't have the same issues, essentially. It's kind of unfair because English is very, very hard to learn. So, and it's worth acknowledging, English is really hard. It's because it's got such a rich history and we're drawing from so many different languages that it is harder. So you do need to put a lot of effort into learning English. However, you can look at Italian is and I probably know that one well, it's a very easy language in that the letters just tend to make their sounds. It's not like groups of letters change sounds. So it's very clear in that way. Once you learn the vowel sounds, you're kind of good, right? So in Italy, they learn the way that it would have been great that we did too, which is through phonics. So it's very clear. These are the sounds, let's sound it out, let's put the sounds together. The same in majority of European countries. And this is why England wasn't actually, even though they're an English-speaking country, they never had this issue because they weren't, this philosophy didn't make it there. So really all across Europe, this whole concept of so many children being illiterate and not learning to read in their formative, like early years of school, that's just unheard of. It's a strange concept.
What's your view on alternative learning philosophies like Steiner or like Montessori?
Steiner, I only know their philosophy. I don't think I can really speak to the way that they teach, other than you're not allowed, if I might be slightly off here, but you're not allowed to learn to read until you're 7 or 8 or something like that. Whilst I appreciate that it doesn't put pressure on a child, right? My concern is my experience of having a friend who had a child going there. They were not allowed to even explore the concept of reading before then. Some children, yes. Okay, so yes, some children take a bit more time. However, I think prohibiting a child from reading before then, I think that's a bit ridiculous, personally. But there's lots of Steiner concepts I like. That really put me off, that sort of around literacy, obviously, because I care about that a lot. Montessori, universities and schools looked more at the Montessori approach. That would actually be really beneficial. Marie Montessori was actually really on the mark with how to teach children to read. So all the, they had like the sand trays, the tracing of the letters, all of that, and saying the sounds is really, really good.
So, Giulia, say I was a teacher that aligned with, like, your view, and I went into a primary school to teach, and I wanted to teach, like, the old school way. Would I be prohibited from that? Like, is there a way of teaching that's accepted and suggested when you're a teacher? Like, how does that work?
It depends on the school that you're at the moment. More schools are getting on board. We call it the science of reading. So essentially it's the science of how the brain learns to read. So it's got this sort of broad term of the science of reading. The problem with that is it's slightly losing its integrity, but more or less that's the sort of the overarching term we're using for it. Depending on the states, some states are now making it mandatory that schools teach the science of reading, which is great. So that means we're really, really on a good pathway with the majority of states. Victoria is a bit everywhere. At the moment, it really depends on what school you're at. So some schools are really, again, going the right way. They've still got quite a long way to go in terms of teachers, in order to teach the science of reading, you need to know a lot about the English language. You need to do a lot of learning yourself. So it's completely different to, like, when I went to university, a lot of it was quite beautiful and sounds great. Other than maths, fairly, you're clear on you've got to teach this and this. But literacy, for me, from my experience of university, was just very, let's read beautiful books, let's do these sorts of things. I was very confused, actually. Where's the actual, how do we teach children actually how to do these things? So, this is why the study that I did, it's equivalent to a postgraduate because it's a lot of work. You have to re-study, you have to learn a lot of new content, and you have to be willing to change your belief system around how kids learn to read. At schools, it's a complete mixed bag. So you, like, as a parent, you would need to do research on each school and really find out what principals are sort of on the right pathway. But then it's also down to the classroom teacher. And this is kind of the first time where I've really found that to be a really big issue. Normally I'll go, okay, well, that school is doing all of this. I can believe that whatever teacher my child has, I can feel fairly confident. Now, not so much. Now, because more and more teachers are sort of waking up to where we're at and the problem that we're in, and they are re-educating themselves, which is what all teachers should be doing. Some teachers are, and some teachers are burying their head and not wanting to. So really, even if you're at a school that is following the science of reading, you're not necessarily going to get a teacher who's doing that. When I graduated, but when I went straight to a remote community, so I was teaching Aboriginal students, and immediately it occurred to me, I don't know how to teach these kids to read, and they cannot read, and it's not like they're getting anything that's going to, unless I give it to them, they're not going to be exposed to anything. Because there's not literature at homes. Well, in the community I was in, literature that I was exposed to was through me. And all the kids would come to school, which was really fantastic. But I was their be all and end all, really. So I started my study then, and it took me a good few years to re-educate myself. So, yeah, we're in a point where you don't know what kind of teacher you'll get. My hope is that we will get to a point in 10 years, maybe that where you could say all of these schools are following the right approach.
Interesting, because I would have thought, like, particularly with public schools, that the methodologies would have been standardized and distilled through to the classrooms.
This is kind of the strange thing. So we have a curriculum, and each state has its own curriculum. We also have an Australian curriculum. So the Victorian curriculum it's changed, but it hasn't standardized the way that we teach literacy. Or teach children to read, let's say. They've modified the curriculum, so it will say things to do with phonics, right? There's many other components to it. It'll have that in the curriculum. However, they're not explicitly saying you need to stop. We call it balanced literacy, which is the wrong approach. You need to stop, or whole language. You need to stop this and you must do this. That hasn't happened yet. So despite the curriculum having the way we need to teach, and it could be better, but it's getting better, so let's be happy about that. Reading. So we do, the intervention that we do there's lots of programs that teach schools that you can follow that's similar to it. There's also, some parents would have heard of reading recovery, which is where it all went wrong. Essentially, reading recovery was the beginning of the end for a lot of kids. Majority of schools don't do it anymore, but some schools still do, and it should be banned. So again, some states have banned it, so you're not allowed to do it anymore, but that's not across the board. So where it is state by state and still school by school in Victoria until we are much, much clearer with what's allowed and what shouldn't be, really.
I think it's important, right? Like our kids are our resources, right? Like, and you're talking about a prosperous country and a nation, and like you would have thought that a lot of that would have been standardized at a national, federal level and then distilled down to the states. Like, in general, where does the innovation come from? Is it from academics doing research?
Yeah, so generally, yes. So it's from the university level, and we're this is a good thing. So we're changing in the right direction because we're moving away from belief systems around what I want for kids, but that's we're talking like decades of I believe children should learn this way. I believe. And rather than let's actually look at the data, or let's actually do some actual research. And we have the research out there, actually. There's like some really good researchers, the academics that are actually figuring out what is best for kids. So it doesn't take long to find all of that. But there's still too many professors, academics, and then teachers who are teaching the way that they believe we should learn. We should teach kids to learn. Depending on where you look, there's two, Melbourne University and Charles Sturt University, really, really making some really great changes. So the professors there, really, really, really good. So if I could restudy, I would go there for sure. But it's still, that's those two universities. Again, it's not all universities,
With Victoria being one of the areas that were on the longest lockdown, like I think in the world, how has that been compounded, from a lack of skills perspective with this type of teaching style? Like, have you seen a real huge impact because of COVID and obviously this style?
There's two things to that. I think parents are putting too much emphasis on the damage that COVID did. Whilst, yes, lots of kids had to learn online and all of that, but that's not to blame. It's if your child was being taught well, and if they academically weren't going to have any issues, having lockdown would have made it really hasn't made any difference to those kids. The children that would struggle, so the ones with learning difficulties, yes, they definitely struggled more online, and that online learning, I had to do it during that whole time. It's not great. It's pretty rough. But again, it's still, I don't think it's reasonable at this point where we're up to now to be blaming back then anymore. So I think what I found that parents have said to me is that when they were sitting with their child and they were watching the teaching, many parents had these moments where they questioned what the teacher was doing. So where the teacher was teaching, and I'm talking literacy here, teaching them to read or to spell, and the parent was sitting there getting very confused of how is this teaching my child to read. So, I've had many conversations, and if anything, COVID and the lockdowns, and this is the same for America, it's actually sparked many parents to investigate what is going on. Why is my child being taught in this way that makes no sense? And push them to query that and force change to happen. So really, it was actually kind of beneficial in that way. And there's a whole, like in America, there's been like a whole revolution of this, which is impacting us as well. And it was really sparked through COVID, where parents were sitting with their child trying to help them. They realised their child doesn't know how to read when they thought they did. So lots of, oh my God, my child can't read, and I thought they could. They're watching the teacher and thinking, this doesn't make sense. How is this teaching them to read or to spell? And then they're investigating themselves, and they're realising, oh my gosh, this whole school system is just based on this belief that children memorise words and they use pictures. When you think about it, when you actually think about that, it's just, that's ridiculous. That we learn to read through looking at a picture.
Two things there. When I was told that my son had some issues, I was not surprised. I started to sense it. But there were a couple interesting things. Like when we were reading, he kept telling me that they do the sound, but they don't know the letter. And my mind was blown, right? And my first thing is like, I'm a person that like goes into like rage quickly. I'm like, what? I'm like, what? And the other weird thing too, to your point, like the readers he gets, he always looks at the pictures and I cover them, because it's like, dude, you're not reading. Like it's giving you this false sense of like reality that you actually know what you're looking at. And so, and then the only overlay is to think about, well, how did I come up, right? Like, and yeah, so I think your point is valid. Do private schools have the same dilemma? Like, how are those systems different or same?
From my experience with working with a lot of kids from a lot of schools, yes, they are at the same point. The Catholic education system has just recently announced a complete overhaul. So if you're going to a Catholic school in Victoria, things are looking really, really good. But no, being at a private school doesn't really change anything. The only benefits of a private school is that you have a much smaller class size and it will never get bigger. In public schools, there's nothing they can do about it. If they have more enrollments, they have to increase their size based on funding. But like a lot of private schools will have more money for having an extra support teacher in the class, more money for intervention. So those things are really beneficial. So in a private school, you get those benefits, but the actual teaching is school by school. There's no way of saying, yeah, it's definitely way better. Not necessarily at all.
So, Giulia, say I have, and I do, a 3-year-old, and now I want to be proactive because of the situation I've had with my 6-year-old. Like, do you think getting into programs like yours and doing interventions proactively, it's the way to go? Like, what's your view?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm also a parent, so I have a 4-year-old, nearly 5-year-old, and the same with my son who's 1.5. I think, what would I do with my resources, and also what would I hope other parents would do as well. There's lots of things that you can do at home, right? There's a lot that you can actually do at home. But yes, like my daughter, she maybe doesn't need to do any sort of pre-literacy lessons because, yeah, I think she's got me, so I think she would be fine at school. But I think she would benefit from it. So to me, I think, why not, if you have the ability to, and so there's something that you can access, in your area, I think absolutely take advantage of it. Why not give them the best start? That's sort of my belief. I know it's not everybody's, but why not make sure that you're putting everything in place for them? Because just because they're going to your local school and, lots of kids are gone there, it doesn't mean they're going to get the absolute best education. So yes, but let's complement that. Let's help them as much as you can, whilst also knowing there's a lot you can still do at home. So even if that's not even an option for parents, there's a lot more than, yes, please still read books to your children, but there's a lot more that you can do other than just reading. That does very much help them with those pre-literacy skills.
It's really interesting if you think about it. Like, as parents, it feels like we're willing to kind of invest in sports and we understand the concept of practice 3 days a week. But I do feel, speaking to contemporaries, like they leverage they over-index on confidence towards the school. Like, oh, I put my kid there. And maybe that's like the first world problem. Like, we're under this kind of guys that, oh, we'll just hand our kids to the school and they'll come back and be rocket scientists.
I think that is actually a first world problem because you look at a lot of the immigrant communities I'll speak to in Melbourne, they don't just assume that schools will do all the work. They put in a lot of work themselves as well because they don't see the education system as doing everything. And I really think that's important for all parents to understand because, again, I get parents coming to me. I thought the school was teaching my child to read. They're in year 4, year 5, year 6, and I've just realised now they can't read and they can't spell because they put all their trust in the school. So I think, parents need to realise that some of it's on them as well in what can they do to support them at home and how, be involved. At least the most important thing is have a really good dialogue with every classroom teacher each year. Don't sort of wait for the teacher to come to you. I would always be checking in, looking at what your child is taking home and constantly checking in with the teacher to make sure, am I happy with what I'm seeing coming from the teacher, but also from my child? Am I sure that they're on the right pathway? Because even, in prep, again, you're going, okay, this is just prep, but it's actually a really, really, really important year. Your child should be making a really big leap in their learning in prep. It's not just prep. It's not just a play year. It's a really, really important year. So again, I think parents sort of, I won't worry. I'll wait till they're in year 1. You wait till you're there in year 1 and they're already a year, 6 months behind. Why not be checking in now? So my opinion is, yeah, you should be, if you have any concerns, act on those concerns straight away. Even if the teacher says, let's wait a little bit longer. No, waiting never helps anything.
Are there any signs that you could get from your child that they're struggling? What would they be?
Okay, so this is what I try and communicate to parents of all ages. You can tell that your child might have something like dyslexia from around 3. There are signs all the way up. So in the pre-literacy years, so 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and even earlier, right? So if they're slow to pick up speech, so they're really, really quite slow to talk, poor vocabulary, not interested in nursery rhymes, as in they don't appreciate the sing-songiness of them. They don't get involved in that. They can't hear that rhyme. So really not understanding. So that comes with not understanding, not appreciating nursery rhymes. You're not getting those rhyme sounds. Those things are very clear indicators of, we call them red flags for dyslexia. You can see the kids that are in kinder, they could be screened and flagged for having markers, let's say for potential dyslexia or dysgraphia, which is the writing form. You can see a child just cannot for the life of them figure out how to hold a pencil or a text or a crayon. They're really struggling to sit up and to form any shape, draw pictures. They're just not interested. They have refused to ever pick up a pencil. They just want to, play outside. Those are actual red flags. There's a reason why they don't want to do that, and it's because there's underlying problems there. So, yeah, you can see it at the kinder age. In prep, you can see they're the ones that are just really just not picking up the letter sounds or remembering the letter sounds or remembering the letter names. It's just in and out. They just cannot retain that. If there's a child like that, that's a big indicator. And actually, even at the younger age, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, if they're exposed to it, can produce rhyme, but they can also, with your daughter, if you expose her to it, the same sort of thing that I did with your son, if you say the sounds, that's a bad example. Let's say sun, and you just do it really easy to start with. Sun. That's to us is so obvious, but to a child that's hard. If they can go, oh yeah, that's sun, easy, that's good, right? But if they're finding those things really, 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 really hard and still in prep, just not able to do that, those are red flags. So rather than going, let's just wait and see in year 1, they're just going to get further behind. They're not going to pick it up unless you're actually teaching them explicitly and giving them some intervention. So there's there's indicators all the way up. So I see kids from, prep to, what's the oldest, year 11, and I can tell at any of those ages whether they potentially have dyslexia or dysgraphia. So yeah, you something that frustrates me is that parents could do with getting that in that education, so that they know, okay, my child, or perhaps I struggled at school, maybe it's likely my child might too. Let's maybe just have a little check-in. Like, really, I could go into a kinder, I could look at a few kids in a few minutes and I could tell you, okay, this child, what are we going to do to support them before they start school? It would make the world of difference for them.
I think there's a lot in that, and talking about like how to habituate our children to reading and literacy, and how as a parent to do it skillfully, because I find like I lose my shit too, right? Like I want to be so patient.
It's easy to get frustrated. Yeah.
What's your recommendation on how to do that? Like, should we be getting them, depending on their age, to read daily? Like, what's the plan?
With 3-year-olds and 4, like before school, so 3, 4, and 5, and even younger, like 2-year-olds, depending on, again, their language, you absolutely should be doing nursery rhymes, reading them and singing them, put them in the car, sing them all the time. It's really, really beneficial for them. As well as that, I would recommend buying an alphabet puzzle, like the ones buy a nice one rather than just a one that's not great quality. Buy a good quality one. And there's uppercase and lowercase. You can get both. There's so much you can do with that. So you could get them to say the alphabet, because we do need to know the alphabet. That's really important. So going A, B, C, as they put the letters into the puzzle, then you can do it with saying the sounds. The one that I have, there's actually the letter itself. So I would get my daughter to trace around the letter. So there's, in just that one puzzle, you can say the alphabet, you can say the letter names, the letter sounds, you can practice tracing the letters. There's all things that parents can do at home. If anything, singing the alphabet song every single day and less letting them sort of see the letters as they sing it, that's hugely beneficial. So yes, I would say all those pre-literacy things, that's what you should be doing. And like I said, like the game of, I'm thinking of this thing. So like I'm thinking of a can you guess what it is? That's a really, like, those are the pre-literacy skills that you really want to develop. So even if your child is a bit older and you think they're struggling, go back and do those things, because that's what they'll have to do in intervention anyway. You need to go back to those skills. And then you can reverse that. So you say, can you tell me the sounds in sun? Much harder. And they have to say So I did that a lot with my daughter. Like, let's say maybe a year ago, I made little games like that. You can get like little figure eight, like little animals. You can do, and for syllables, I would forget syllables. Syllables is really important as well. So you could say, like, you have a bag of the animals that, kids always have. Okay, I've got something in my hand in here. It's an elephant. Can I get it? So that's still really important. And then they do it to you. It's an elephant. You want them to practice it in the reverse as well. All of those things you can, use. I just use all our little toys at home, plus an alphabet. Really, really make a huge impact. And actually, writing. So, like, get an easel. If most kids have easels at home. No, that's not really true. A lot of kids have easels at home. I would invest in an easel. I chose to get an easel rather than just at a table, because when you write on a vertical plane, you're building your core strength, and your core strength is part of writing. So the kids that really struggle with writing generally have really weak core. They're the ones that like really struggle to even sit on the ground without wobbling. They really need that. So from a really young age, so from 1, giving them an easel to just do big motions on is extremely helpful. You wouldn't realise, but that's actually that's getting them ready for writing in several years' time. So just painting, drawing, really good.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to weave Mara into the sessions now with the healing, because I've always kind of kept her out because I found her to be a bit disruptive at times, but I actually think it'd be beneficial for her, and I can dumb it down, and he can help her too, so he feels like there's a level of accountability, and he's adding value, and he maybe gets some confidence from the process too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're gonna wrap this up, Giulia, but I firstly want to thank you for the time today, and I know that you have physical locations of the tutoring centers, but you also do workbooks online, right? Is that?
Yeah, so they're called the MSL workbook. So what we do is MSL. So I made the workbooks initially for parents to do at home, because majority of kids come once a week, and parents always are asking what they can do in between. So I made the workbooks that they can just literally get the book, keep it with them, and they just sort of follow along. And just because children need daily repetition, daily practice, but teachers also use them, and I use it for myself as well, because it's handy to have some or like thought out work rather than you having to think of it all the time. So it's good for parents and teachers as well.
Where can they find that, Giulia? What's your website?
So if you go, probably the easiest is if you go on the rangerslearningcentre.com.au. That's the tutoring business, but at the bottom there's like a link to the workbooks as well. It's probably just easiest to do it that way.
Excellent. Well, Giulia, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it, yeah?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.